When my boss demoted me from senior analyst to data entry clerk, he thought he was teaching me humility. Instead, he just gave me the perfect position to destroy his career from the inside. My name is Sarah, and until 3 months ago, I was living what most people would call a dream life. At 28, I was the youngest senior financial analyst at Morrison & Associates, a prestigious consulting firm in downtown Seattle. I had a corner cubicle with a partial view of Elliott Bay, respect from my colleagues, and a salary that let me finally pay off my student loans while saving for a house. More importantly, I was good at what I did. Really good. My financial models had saved clients millions, and my quarterly reports were so thorough that other departments started requesting my analysis for their projects. I'd worked 60-hour weeks for 3 years straight to earn that position, sacrificing weekends, relationships, and sleep to prove I belonged in a company where most senior analysts had decades of experience and Ivy League degrees. I had neither, just a state school MBA and an unshakable work ethic inherited from my immigrant parents. Everything changed the day Richard Blackwood became my direct supervisor. Richard was a 45-year-old company veteran who'd been passed over for the department head position twice in 5 years. When management finally created a senior supervisory analyst role specifically for him, everyone knew it was a consolation prize. Everyone except Richard, who saw it as his chance to finally wield the power he felt he deserved. From day one, Richard made it clear he didn't think I belonged in my position. During our first one-on-one meeting, he looked over my performance reviews with barely concealed disdain. "Impressive numbers, Sarah," he said, not sounding impressed at all. "But numbers don't tell the whole story, do they? There's something to be said for experience, for understanding how things really work around here." I nodded politely, assuming he was just establishing his authority. I'd dealt with difficult supervisors before. Keep your head down, do excellent work, and eventually they'd have to acknowledge your value. I was naive. Over the next 6 weeks, Richard systematically began undermining everything I did. When I submitted my monthly analysis of the Henderson Industries account, he sent it back with a note that my methodology seemed questionable. When I asked for specifics, he said he'd know it when he saw it, and told me to think more strategically. He started excluding me from client meetings I'd previously led, telling me I needed to observe and learn before I could handle such important responsibilities. When clients specifically requested my analysis, Richard would assign the work to me but present the findings himself, introducing my insights as his own strategic thinking. The breaking point came during the quarterly review meeting with our biggest client, Meridian Tech. I'd spent 2 weeks developing a comprehensive risk assessment model that identified potential cost savings of nearly $2 million. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that had made my reputation. Richard presented my work to the client without mentioning my name once. When the CEO of Meridian Tech praised the brilliant analysis, Richard smiled and accepted the compliment graciously. "This is the kind of strategic thinking that comes from experience," he told the room. "It takes years to develop this level of insight." I sat in the back of the conference room, watching Richard bask in praise for work that had kept me up until 3 a.m. for 12 straight nights. My colleagues avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge their new supervisor. After the meeting, I requested a private conversation with Richard. I was professional, respectful, and direct. "Richard, I appreciate the opportunity to work on the Meridian project, but I think there was some confusion about the attribution of the analysis. I'd like to ensure that going forward, we're clear about individual contributions to client deliverables." His expression darkened. "Sarah, I think you're misunderstanding your role here. You're part of a team. We succeed together and we fail together. The client doesn't need to know about every person who touches a project. They want to see leadership, experience, and authority." "I understand teamwork," I replied carefully, "but my performance reviews have always highlighted my individual contributions. I'm concerned that this approach might impact my ability to demonstrate my value during promotion cycles." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with the look of someone who'd just been presented with an interesting problem to solve. "Sarah, I think we need to discuss your attitude. You seem to have developed some unrealistic expectations about your position here. Maybe it's time for a reset." The next morning, I found an email in my inbox scheduling a meeting with Richard and HR representative Janet Walsh for the following afternoon. The subject line read, "Position restructuring discussion." My stomach dropped. I spent the entire day trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, replaying every interaction with Richard, every project deliverable, every client email. I'd never received anything but excellent performance reviews. My work was impeccable. My colleagues respected me. Clients requested me specifically. None of that mattered. In the HR meeting, Richard presented a carefully constructed narrative about my attitude problems and inability to adapt to team dynamics. He described me as resistant to feedback and overly focused on individual recognition rather than team success. Janet Walsh nodded along, taking notes that I suspected had been written before I ever entered the room. "Sarah, we want to help you succeed here," she said with practiced sympathy. "Sometimes a change in responsibilities can provide valuable perspective and help reset unhealthy patterns." Effective immediately, I was being moved to a developmental role as a data entry specialist. My salary would be cut by $35,000. My corner cubicle would be replaced by a desk in the basement filing room. All my client relationships would be transferred to other analysts. "This isn't permanent," Richard assured me, his voice dripping with false concern. "Think of it as an opportunity to learn humility and rebuild your foundation. If you can demonstrate the right attitude in this role, we can discuss your future in 6 months." I sat in stunned silence, watching my 3-year career crumble in real time. Everything I'd worked for, every sacrifice I'd made, every 60-hour week that had brought me to this point, erased with a few sentences about attitude problems that existed only in Richard's imagination. As I cleaned out my desk that evening, boxing up the awards and commendations that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life, I made a decision that would change everything. Richard thought he was teaching me a lesson about humility and knowing my place. He had no idea that he'd just given me the perfect position to teach him a lesson instead. The basement of Morrison & Associates was a forgotten kingdom of abandoned files, humming servers, and fluorescent lights that flickered like dying stars. It was here, surrounded by 20 years of corporate detritus, that I began to understand the true architecture of the company and Richard's many vulnerabilities. My new role as data entry specialist was Richard's idea of poetic justice. 8 hours a day, I sat at a metal desk inputting client information, financial records, and employee data into the company's various systems. It was mind-numbing work that Richard clearly expected would break my spirit and send me running to a different company. Instead, it gave me something far more valuable than my corner office ever had: access to everything. The irony was perfect. In his eagerness to humiliate me, Richard had inadvertently placed me at the nerve center of the company's information flow. Every contract, every employee record, every financial transaction eventually passed through the basement for digital archiving. I had legitimate access to databases that senior analysts could only dream of seeing. And I had something else Richard hadn't counted on: allies. The basement wasn't just my domain. I shared it with John, a 53-year-old IT specialist who'd been relegated to the basement after questioning some creative expense reporting by senior management 3 years earlier. There was also Linda Park, a former senior accountant who'd been demoted after refusing to sign off on some questionable billings that later turned out to be fraudulent. We were Morrison & Associates' island of misfit toys, the casualties of corporate politics who'd been buried alive in the basement rather than fired outright. The company kept us around because we were competent, experienced, and, most importantly, we knew where too many bodies were buried to safely terminate us. "So you're Richard's latest victim," John said on my first day, not looking up from the server he was repairing. "Welcome to the resistance," Linda laughed bitterly. "That man has been destroying careers for years. You're just the newest addition to his collection." Over lunch in the basement break room, a converted storage closet with a card table and a microwave that only worked on Tuesdays, I learned the full scope of Richard's reign of terror. In the 18 months since his promotion, he'd managed to force out or demote 6 different employees who'd posed even minor threats to his authority. There was Jennifer Martinez, a brilliant junior analyst who'd caught errors in one of Richard's client presentations. She'd been transferred to the mailroom and quit within a month. David Kim, who'd suggested a more efficient reporting process, found himself assigned to filing duty until he took a job with a competitor. Sarah Williams, yes, another Sarah, had been written up for insubordination after questioning Richard's decision to bill a client for work they hadn't requested. "The man's got a system," Linda explained. "He identifies threats, isolates them, then creates paper trails to justify their removal. HR rubber stamps everything because he's careful to make it look legitimate." "How does he get away with it?" I asked. John snorted. "Same way bullies always get away with it. He picks targets who can't fight back effectively, and he makes sure there's always plausible deniability. Plus, his numbers look good because he takes credit for everyone else's work." That night, I went home to my studio apartment, all I could afford on my reduced salary, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Everything John and Linda had told me aligned perfectly with my own experience. Richard wasn't just a bad boss. He was a predator who'd weaponized the corporate system against anyone who threatened his fragile ego. But understanding the problem was only half the battle. I needed a solution. The answer came to me during my second week in the basement, when I was digitizing old employee files and stumbled across something interesting: Richard's own disciplinary history. It seemed our dear supervisor hadn't always been the model employee he pretended to be. 3 years earlier, before his promotion, Richard had received a written warning for inappropriate workplace conduct after a female colleague filed a complaint about his behavior during a business trip. The file contained emails, witness statements, and a formal reprimand that had never been added to his official personnel record. The complaint had been quietly buried after Richard agreed to attend sensitivity training and accept a temporary salary reduction. But the paperwork was all there, meticulously documented and stored in the basement archives where Richard probably assumed no one would ever see it. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I created a detailed spreadsheet of Richard's management decisions over the past 18 months. Every demotion, every termination, every disciplinary action. I cross-referenced dates with employee performance reviews, client feedback, and project outcomes. The pattern that emerged was damning. Richard consistently targeted high-performing employees who received praise from clients or recognition from senior management. His actions had nothing to do with performance or attitude problems. They were systematic retaliation against anyone who might overshadow him. Better yet, his decisions were costing the company money. The employees he'd driven away had taken valuable client relationships with them. Several major accounts had reduced their contracts after key personnel left. The department's overall performance metrics had declined steadily since Richard's promotion. But I needed more than patterns and correlations. I needed smoking gun evidence. That's when I remembered something from my financial analyst training: follow the money. If Richard was stealing credit for other people's work, there had to be a paper trail somewhere. I began systematically reviewing project files, comparing initial assignments with final deliverables and billing records. What I found was even better than I'd hoped. Richard wasn't just stealing credit. He was committing billing fraud. Over the past year, he'd been charging clients for senior strategic analysis while assigning the actual work to junior analysts and data specialists. The billing codes showed clients being charged premium rates for Richard's personal time, even when he'd contributed nothing more than reviewing and presenting other people's work. In one particularly egregious example, Meridian Tech had been charged $15,000 for executive-level strategic consultation on a project that Richard had assigned entirely to me and 2 junior analysts. According to his calendar entries, which I could access through the shared administrative system, Richard had spent a total of 30 minutes reviewing our final report before presenting it as his own analysis. This wasn't just unethical. It was fraud. And fraud was exactly the kind of clear-cut violation that even Morrison and Associates, notoriously conflict-averse HR department, couldn't ignore. But I couldn't just walk into Janet Walsh's office with a stack of printouts and expect her to take action. Richard had spent months positioning me as a disgruntled employee with attitude problems. Any accusations from me would be dismissed as revenge fantasy. I needed to be smarter than that. Over the next 3 weeks, I carefully documented everything. Every fraudulent billing entry, every stolen project, every pattern of retaliation. I created a comprehensive timeline with supporting documentation, cross-referenced with employee testimonies, and client communications. But more importantly, I began building my case through official channels. I started by filing anonymous tips with the company's ethics hotline, providing just enough detail to prompt internal investigations. I submitted routine audit requests for billing discrepancies I'd accidentally discovered while doing data entry. I asked innocent questions about project attribution that forced other departments to review Richard's claims. Each action was small, legitimate, and completely within my authority as a data entry specialist. Individually, none of them would have raised suspicions. Together, they created a web of official inquiries that would soon trap Richard in his own lies. The beauty of the plan was its subtlety. Richard had no idea that his former victim was systematically dismantling his career from the basement. He probably assumed I was broken, defeated, counting down the days until I found a new job. Instead, I was counting down the days until his inevitable downfall. By the end of my 4th week in the basement, all the pieces were in place. The company's internal audit department had 3 separate inquiries pending regarding Richard's billing practices. HR had received multiple anonymous complaints about his management style, and I had compiled enough evidence to bury him 10 times over. Richard thought he'd taught me humility by putting me in the basement. Soon he was going to learn that humility was the least of his problems. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 6 weeks after I had started building my case against Richard. I was in the basement, pretending to focus on data entry while actually monitoring the internal audit system, when I saw the notification I'd been waiting for. Billing audit escalated to senior management review. Within hours, the basement became ground zero for corporate chaos. Internal audit teams swept through our filing systems, requesting specific client files and billing records that I'd strategically flagged in my anonymous reports. John, Linda, and I exchanged knowing glances as investigators carried boxes of evidence past our desks. "Looks like someone's having a bad day upstairs," John muttered, but his eyes were bright with anticipation. The beautiful thing about corporate investigations is their inevitability. Once the audit department starts pulling threads, they can't stop until they've unraveled everything. My carefully planted seeds had grown into a full-scale inquiry that was now completely beyond Richard's control. By Wednesday afternoon, Richard himself appeared in the basement, the first time he'd set foot in our domain since my demotion. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his designer tie loosened, and there was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the basement's perpetual chill. "Sarah," he said, trying to maintain his authoritative tone, but failing to hide the desperation in his voice, "I need you to pull the Henderson Industries files from last quarter. All of them. Client communications, billing records, everything." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," I replied with perfect professional courtesy. "Is there a specific issue I should be aware of? I want to make sure I provide exactly what you need." The muscle in his jaw twitched. "Just the files, Sarah. Complete and accurate." I spent the rest of the afternoon pulling together Richard's requested files, making sure to include every document that would further incriminate him. The Henderson Industries account was particularly damaging, a case where Richard had billed the client for over 40 hours of senior strategic analysis while I'd done all the actual work during my off hours. Thursday brought the second wave, HR interviews. Janet Walsh had been relegated to taking statements from employees about Richard's management practices, and the parade of current and former staff members painting a picture of systematic abuse was devastating. I was interviewed Friday afternoon. Janet sat across from me in a sterile conference room, her expression carefully neutral as she asked about my experiences with Richard's supervision. "I understand you've had some challenges adjusting to your new role," she began, clearly expecting me to be the disgruntled employee Richard had painted me as. Instead, I was prepared. "Actually, Janet, I've found my current position quite enlightening. The data entry role has given me a unique perspective on the company's operations and billing practices." I slid a carefully prepared folder across the table. "I've documented some discrepancies that I think the company should be aware of." Her expression shifted as she opened the folder and saw page after page of meticulously documented evidence. Fraudulent billing entries, stolen project credits, pattern analysis of Richard's retaliation against high-performing employees. Everything I'd been building for 6 weeks, presented in the kind of analytical format that had made my reputation as a senior analyst. "This is quite comprehensive," she said, clearly struggling to reconcile the professional analysis in front of her with Richard's narrative about my supposed incompetence. "I have always been thorough in my work," I replied smoothly, "even in data entry." The weekend passed slowly, but Monday brought the finale I'd been orchestrating for over a month. Richard was called to a meeting with senior management, HR, and the company's legal counsel at 9 a.m. sharp. From my basement desk, I watched the corporate drama unfold through the building's internal communications. Emergency meetings were scheduled and canceled. Senior partners arrived looking grim. The company's external legal firm was contacted for urgent consultation. At 2:47 p.m., security escorted Richard Blackwood out of the building. The official email went out an hour later. Effective immediately, Richard Blackwood is no longer employed with Morrison & Associates. Interim supervisory responsibilities for the financial analysis department will be handled by senior partner Michelle Torres, pending permanent staffing decisions. The charges, as I learned through the office grapevine, were extensive: billing fraud, misappropriation of intellectual property, creating hostile work environments, and falsifying employee performance evaluations. The company was conducting a full audit of every account Richard had managed, and several clients had already been contacted about billing adjustments. But the real victory came 3 days later, when Michelle Torres appeared in the basement personally. "Sarah, I think we need to have a conversation," she said, her tone nothing like the corporate speak I'd grown used to from Janet Walsh. "Upstairs, now." I followed her to the executive floor, past the conference room where Richard had destroyed my career just 2 months earlier, and into an office that still smelled like fresh paint and new furniture. "I've spent the last 3 days reviewing the Richard Blackwood situation," Michelle began without preamble. "The evidence you provided to HR was instrumental in uncovering a pattern of fraud and misconduct that could have cost this company millions in legal liability." She leaned forward, studying me with the kind of analytical intensity I recognized from my own work. "I also reviewed your original personnel files, your client feedback scores, and your project outcomes from before Richard's supervision. The disconnect between your actual performance and his evaluations is remarkable." "I tried to raise concerns about the performance review process," I said carefully. "I'm sure you did. And I'm sure you were told to adjust your attitude and learn humility." Her expression was grim. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. This company made a serious error in how we handled Richard's management of your department. We allowed personal vendettas to override objective performance evaluation, and we nearly lost one of our most valuable analysts as a result." She slid a document across her desk. "I'd like to offer you the senior financial analyst position in the strategic accounts division. It's a 30% salary increase from your previous role, plus oversight of our 3 largest client relationships. You'll report directly to me, and I can guarantee that your actual contributions will be recognized and rewarded appropriately." I looked down at the offer letter, at numbers that represented not just financial security but vindication of everything I'd worked for. But more than that, it was proof that merit and determination could still triumph over corporate politics and personal vendettas. "I accept," I said simply. The transition back to senior analyst was surreal. My new office wasn't just a corner cubicle. It was an actual office with a door, a window overlooking Elliott Bay, and enough space for the kind of complex analysis work that had always been my passion. My first assignment was leading the forensic accounting effort to clean up the mess Richard had left behind, work that would eventually save Morrison & Associates over $3 million in fraudulent billings and potential legal settlements. 6 months later, I received a promotion to principal analyst, the youngest person in company history to reach that level. The basement office became a storage room again, but John and Linda were both offered positions in their original departments, with full restoration of their previous salaries and seniority. Richard, according to the legal grapevine, was facing both civil and criminal charges for his billing fraud. His attempts to find new employment in the financial consulting industry had been unsuccessful, largely because word travels fast in Seattle's tight-knit professional community. The real satisfaction, though, came from the changes that rippled through Morrison and Associates after Richard's downfall. The company implemented new oversight procedures for billing practices, established anonymous reporting systems for management misconduct, and created a formal appeals process for performance evaluations. During the company's annual meeting, CEO James Morrison personally thanked me for exemplifying the integrity and analytical rigor that defines our organization. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd received more recognition in 6 months as a vindicated whistleblower than I had in 3 years as a high-performing analyst. On the 1-year anniversary of my demotion, I found myself back in the building's basement, not as a punishment, but by choice. I was reviewing archived files for a major client presentation, working late because I genuinely loved the complexity of the analysis I was developing. Linda knocked on the doorframe. "Burning the midnight oil again?" "Old habits," I said, looking up from my laptop. "Plus, I kinda like it down here." "Quiet. Good for thinking," she laughed. "Amazing how different a place looks when you're there by choice instead of exile." As she headed home, I reflected on everything that had happened since that devastating day when Richard had tried to teach me humility. He'd been right about one thing. I had learned a lesson in that basement. I'd learned that power isn't about your title or your office or your ability to intimidate others. Real power comes from competence, integrity, and the patience to let justice work through proper channels. I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't personal. It's simply ensuring that the truth comes to light. Richard thought he was putting me in my place when he sent me to the basement. Instead, he'd given me the perfect vantage point to see his empire's weak foundations and the tools I needed to bring it all crashing down. The lesson he'd intended to teach me about humility had backfired spectacularly. Instead, I'd taught him something far more valuable, that in a world built on merit and integrity, bullies always eventually face their reckoning. And sometimes, that reckoning comes from the very people they tried to destroy.